The aliens launched a surprise invasion. They never noticed the planet was called Earth. Part 1. First contact tastes like ash. The sky cracked open at 0314 hours, and I was already running. Not because someone told me to run. Not because the alert system had sounded, it hadn't, not yet. I ran because I had been watching the northern horizon for 6 hours straight, and the color that bloomed across it at that moment was not any color the sky was supposed to be. It was a deep, pulsing violet, like a bruise spreading across the atmosphere, and every nerve in my body fired at once. I was Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 3-year veteran of the 3rd Mobile Infantry, currently assigned to Forward Observation Post 7, sitting on a frozen ridge in the middle of nowhere with a pair of thermal binoculars and a half-eaten ration pack. My unit, 6 soldiers, was camped 200 meters below me in a shallow valley. I hit my radio before my boots stopped moving. Post 7 to command. Do you have anything unusual on high-altitude sensors right now? A pause. 3 seconds, which in military communication is a lifetime. Post 7, confirm your grid. Say again, confirm your grid. That pause. That request for confirmation instead of an answer. That was when I knew. Grid 79er Echo, ridge line north of marker 12. Command, I am looking at an atmospheric event approximately 40 kilometers north of my position. Violet in color. Covering roughly, I pressed the binoculars to my face, 20 degrees of horizon. It is not natural. What is that? Another pause. Longer this time. Post 7, stand by. Stand by. 2 words that have ended more soldiers than bad weather. I did not stand by. I scrambled down the ridge, kicking loose gravel, and hit the valley floor at a full run. Up, I said. Everyone up. Right now. Corporal Owen Davies was already awake. He had that instinct, the kind you cannot train into a person. He looked at my face and started moving without asking a question. Private Lena Price was 3 seconds behind him. The others came online fast, the way experienced soldiers do when one of their own arrives wearing a particular expression. I did not have time to explain the expression. The sky above us had shifted. From our position in the valley, we could see only a slice of it, but that slice had changed color. The stars were gone. Something vast was between us and them. Pods, Owen said quietly. He was looking up with his naked eye, no equipment. Those are descent pods. He was right. I could see them now, dozens of dark shapes dropping through the upper atmosphere in precise formation, shedding heat signatures that glowed briefly before they stabilized. No sonic boom. No trail of fire. They were engineered to arrive quietly, which meant whoever built them understood the value of surprise, which meant they had done this before. My radio came alive. All forward units, all forward units. This is a full alert. Unidentified vessels have entered atmosphere at multiple grid points across the northern hemisphere. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All units are to hold position and await further instruction. Hold position. Await instruction. I looked at Owen. He looked at me. They want us to sit here, Price said. She was 22 years old and had the voice of someone twice her age when she was scared. They want us to not do something reckless, I said. Which is different. The pods landed, if landing is the right word, approximately 400 meters north of our position. They came down in a tight cluster, 3 pods, each the size of a large freight container. The earth shuddered when they hit. Not an explosion. Just impact. Solid and confident, the way something lands when it has done this many times on many worlds and knows exactly how hard the ground will push back. I pulled my unit back to the ridge treeline and set up a proper observation position. We went quiet. We went still. I kept the binoculars on the pods. They opened from the top, petals of dark metal folding outward. What emerged was not what I expected. I had expected something that looked dangerous. What I got was something that looked elegant. 8 figures per pod, 24 total, moving with a coordination that made my unit look like we were operating in slow motion by comparison. They were tall, I estimated 2.5 meters, with 4 limbs used for locomotion and 2 additional upper limbs held close to the body. Their equipment was compact, minimal, and very clearly well designed. They communicated in gestures and brief tonal signals. They deployed in under 40 seconds. They were very good. They had also landed in mud. Not metaphorical mud. Actual mud. We had received 12 centimeters of rain over the previous 4 days, and the valley floor was saturated. I watched the lead figure of the unit take 3 steps and sink to what I estimated was mid-shin depth. It paused. It looked down. It made a signal to the others that I could not interpret but which read, even across species lines, as surprise. They adjusted. They were adaptable, clearly. But the adjustment took time, and in that time the freezing rain that had been threatening all night finally arrived, coming in sideways off the ridge with the kind of enthusiasm that this particular region specialized in producing. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. I had their coordinates. I had a direct radio line to the artillery battery position 12 kilometers south. I read the grid, confirmed it twice, and gave the order. The battery responded in under 90 seconds. The valley below the ridge ceased to be a landing zone. My unit held the tree line. We did not celebrate. We did not speak. We listened to the rain and the distant sounds of a world that had just changed completely, and each of us privately processed the fact that what had just landed on our planet was not alone, was not an accident, and had absolutely no idea what kind of planet it had chosen. I keyed my radio again. Post 7 to command. Pods neutralized, northern grid. Request further orders. Post 7, confirmed. Consolidate and await extraction. Well done, Sergeant. I looked at Owen. He was already writing something in the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. I asked him what he was writing. Grid reference, he said. Date. Number of contacts. Standard report. And. He looked up. And a note that they landed on a flood plain. He paused. During rainy season. Another pause. On a planet they apparently did not fully research. He put the notebook away. I picked up my binoculars and looked north, where 3 more violet blooms were rising against the early morning sky, each one representing another cluster of pods, another landing force, another group of very capable soldiers arriving on a world they had studied from orbit but did not, in any meaningful sense, know. I had a feeling, deep and certain and calm, that this particular mistake was going to cost them considerably. A translation of a recovered Kethera field report, retrieved 6 weeks later from a damaged signal relay, read as follows: resistance encountered at northern insertion point. Terrain conditions suboptimal. Resistance employed indirect fire with high accuracy. Primitive propellant technology but effective use of local geography. Assessment, manageable. Timeline projection, unchanged. These creatures fight with determination but no sophistication. This will be resolved within a season. I read that report when they gave it to me weeks later. I read the word primitives and I set it down on the table and I drank my terrible, lukewarm coffee and I thought about Owen's note in his small notebook, and about the flood plain, and about the rain. Then I picked up my gear and went back to work. Part 2, What History Tastes Like. On day 19, they put me in a room with a linguist and gave me the worst coffee I had ever tasted in my life. The coffee was important. Not because of the coffee itself, but because it told me everything about where we were in the situation. When supply lines are functioning and command is confident, the coffee is tolerable. When everything is being routed to the front and nobody has time to source decent supplies and the people running the war are sleeping in shifts, the coffee tastes like someone boiled cardboard in mildly caffeinated water. This coffee tasted exactly like that. Which meant day 19 was going exactly as I suspected. The linguist's name was Dr. Amara Singh, and she did not look like someone who had slept recently. She was perhaps 40, with dark circles under sharp eyes and the particular energy of a person who is being run on intellectual adrenaline because there is nothing else available. She had a tablet in front of her covered in notation systems I did not recognize and a printed file on the table that was thick enough to use as a doorstop. Sergeant Vasquez, she said. Your field report mentioned you observed their deployment for approximately 4 minutes before calling in coordinates. Correct. And you noted they communicated through gestural and tonal signals. Yes. Can you walk me through what you observed? Specifically, the sequence of gestures when they encountered the terrain conditions. I walked her through it. She listened with the focused attention of someone who is assembling a very complicated puzzle and has just been handed a piece she did not expect. When I finished, she made notes for 30 seconds without speaking. They were surprised, she said. It was not a question. Visibly. The lead figure stopped moving completely for about 2 seconds. That is a long time to freeze when you have just landed in a combat zone. She nodded slowly. They should not have been surprised by mud. No, I agreed. They should not. She turned the tablet around and showed me a map. It was a star map, with 12 points marked in a color that had been chosen, I suspected, because no other color was available and not because anyone thought it looked nice. Each point had a small symbol beside it. The symbols were all variations of the same basic shape. These are the 12 civilizations the Kethera have previously integrated into their structure, she said. That is what they call it. Integration. She said the word with a careful flatness that communicated exactly what she thought of it. Every one of these species encountered the Kethera and, within 60 days, reached a formal settlement. The fastest was 11 days. The slowest was 53. I looked at the map. 12 points. 12 symbols. All variations on the same shape. What does the shape mean? It is their notation for successfully processed. Think of it as a stamp in a bureaucratic file. Case closed, moved on. She pulled the tablet back. In every prior case, the Kethera made contact with a species that had a single dominant governing authority. A global government, or something close enough to function like one. Their model is built around that assumption. You identify the central authority, you demonstrate superior capability, the central authority makes a rational decision to avoid further damage, and the process concludes. I sat with that for a moment. We do not have a single dominant governing authority. We have 195 recognized sovereign nations, she said, 42 of which are currently providing active military support, 63 of which have declared various forms of emergency powers, and approximately 30 of which have not yet formally agreed on what to call what is happening. What are they calling it? Several different things, depending on the country. She allowed herself a brief, tired smile. The Kethera diplomatic team spent the first 11 days attempting to identify who to contact for formal surrender negotiations. They sent a signal to the United Nations. The UN forwarded it to the Security Council. The Security Council forwarded it to a subcommittee. The subcommittee requested clarification on the transmission format. The smile faded. By the time anyone responded, we had already destroyed 14 of their landing sites. I thought about that. I thought about the Kethera diplomat, somewhere above our atmosphere, waiting for a response from a species that was simultaneously fighting them and arguing procedurally about the correct format for alien communication. They have no model for this, I said. None whatsoever. Every species they have ever encountered had the good sense, from their perspective, to have resolved their internal conflicts before reaching the point of spaceflight capability. We have not resolved ours. We brought them with us into the stars. She paused. Or we were about to, before they arrived. She opened the printed file and turned it to face me. It was a series of translated Kethera field reports, compiled chronologically. She had color-coded them, and the color coding told its own story. The early reports were in a calm, neutral tone, the blue of professional confidence. The middle reports shifted to something more cautious. The latest ones, from the past week, were marked in a red that she had probably chosen very deliberately. I read through several of them. The early reports described our military responses with the word conventional. They noted the accuracy of our artillery, the effectiveness of our air support, and the discipline of our infantry with the tone of a teacher grading a competent but unremarkable student. Then, around day 8, the language began to shift. One report noted an engagement in which a Kethera forward unit had been slowed not by military forces but by a group of civilians who had blocked a road with farming equipment and then retreated into buildings that the Kethera could not destroy without risking the structural integrity of surrounding infrastructure they intended to use. The report's author described this as irregular interference and recommended adjusted engagement protocols. Another report, from day 12, noted that in a coastal city, the Kethera ground forces had encountered resistance that did not operate by any recognizable military doctrine. It was not organized. It had no apparent command structure. It did not withdraw when outgunned and did not advance when it had advantage. It simply persisted. The report's author had used a Kethera term that Dr. Singh told me translated approximately as noise that does not stop. They are recalibrating constantly, she said, but they are recalibrating within a framework that does not account for us. Every adjustment they make is still based on the assumption that there is an endpoint where we make a rational decision to accept terms. They cannot model a species that does not have that endpoint. Do we have that endpoint? I asked. Not rhetorically. I genuinely wanted her opinion. She looked at me for a moment. Sergeant, I have spent the past 18 days translating communications from a species that has successfully absorbed 12 civilizations. I have read their assessments of every species they have encountered. You know what word appears in none of those assessments, in reference to any prior species. I waited. Stubborn, she said. They do not have a direct equivalent. They have a word for irrational persistence in the face of hopeless odds, but it is a clinical term. A pathology. Something to be treated, not anticipated. She closed the file. They are beginning to think we are all pathological. I was assigned to a joint intelligence unit the next morning. My official role was field assessment consultant, which was a formal way of saying, you have been in contact with them, you have watched them, you understand something about how they move and think, and we need that. My actual role, as I understood it, was to think like a human being and notice when our plans accounted for things that Kethera planning models would not. It turned out to be less of a specialized skill and more of a permanent condition. I had been thinking like a human being for my entire life. Nobody had ever told me it was an advantage before. I spent the next week in a converted basement that smelled of old concrete and electronic equipment, reviewing reports from multiple theaters of engagement. I read about mountain passes held by infantry units that should have been overrun in hours but were not. I read about coastal approaches that were mined so thoroughly the Kethera naval equivalent had stopped attempting them entirely. I read about a city in the eastern region where the civilian population had, without any military coordination, entirely spontaneously, organized a system of signal flags that provided real-time positional data to the military units operating in the adjacent area. Signal flags. The Kethera had orbital sensor technology and encrypted quantum communication arrays. We had people waving flags from rooftops, and it was working. I read a Kethera intelligence summary that described this particular development and requested a strategic review. The summary's final line read, recommend reclassification of this species threat tier from Tier 2 Primitive 2, and then the classification field was blank. The analyst had started to fill it in and stopped. Perhaps they did not have a tier for what they were looking at. Perhaps they were not sure the tiers went that high. I pinned that summary to the wall above my station and looked at it every morning. Owen came by on day 26 with 2 cups of slightly less terrible coffee and sat across from me and looked at the wall of reports. We are going to win this, he said. It was not a rallying cry. He said it the way a person states a fact they have just confirmed. How confident are you? I asked. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. Very, he said. They are better equipped and they have more experience conquering things. But they have never fought something that was angry about being conquered and also could not agree on anything long enough to stop. He drank his coffee. We are going to run them absolutely ragged. He was right. I already knew he was right. The Kethera had arrived with a model, and the model was wrong, and they were smart enough to know it was wrong but not yet sure what to replace it with. That gap, between knowing your model is wrong and knowing what the right model is, that gap was where we lived. That gap was where we had always lived. Outside, the war continued. The violet blooms had stopped appearing in the sky because the Kethera had stopped landing new units, not retreating, but holding. Consolidating. Reassessing. Above us, in the dark between our atmosphere and their fleet, something was shifting. A strategy was being revised. Below us, in basements and bunkers and improvised command posts and farmhouses with signal flags on the roof, a species that had been practicing survival since before the Kethera had mastered agriculture was doing what it did best. Continuing. Part 3, the weight of 200,000 years. The docking collar caught with a metallic clang that I felt in my back teeth, and then everything was very quiet. 12 of us in a corridor 4 meters long, zero gravity, every surface cold enough to feel through gloves. The Kethera vessel we had just attached to was 3 times the size of anything in our current fleet and running on minimal power. They had not expected anyone to reach them. That was the thing about the Kethera that I kept returning to, even now, 67 days into what the media was calling the resistance and what those of us actually in it called something considerably less poetic. They were exceptional at anticipating things they had seen before. Novel approaches registered as errors in their system rather than threats. We were a novel approach. We had been a novel approach since day one. The breach team was 4 people including myself. Owen was behind me. Corporal Grace Turner, who was the quietest and most terrifyingly competent person I had ever served with, was on my left. Private Finn Alcott, 20 years old and twice as fast as anyone his size had any right to be, was managing the breach equipment. Finn had the door open in 40 seconds. Which was, by our own standards, almost too slow. But we were working in zero gravity on a hull designed by a species that had never considered the possibility of being boarded, and 40 seconds was, under those conditions, an achievement worth noting. We went in. The interior of the Kethera vessel was different from what I had imagined. I had imagined something sleek and technological, the physical expression of a species that had conquered 12 civilizations and considered itself beyond challenge. What I found was something that felt, lived in. The corridors were wider than ours, designed for larger bodies, but they had the accumulated texture of a place that had housed people for a long time. Equipment mounted on the walls showed signs of repeated adjustment and repair. The lighting shifted in subtle gradations that I suspected were tied to some biological rhythm I did not share. It felt, in some way I found difficult to articulate, like a home. I did not have time to find that complicated. We moved. The Kethera crew response was fast, faster than our intelligence had suggested it would be, but it was fast in straight lines. They moved to defensive positions by the most direct routes, which were the routes we were not using. They communicated through their encrypted network, which our people were actively intercepting. They formed effective barriers at the locations where, by any reasonable tactical model, the threat should be coming from. We came from the locations where, by any reasonable tactical model, it made no sense to go. Through maintenance corridors that had no defensive coverage because no one had imagined anyone small enough to use them aggressively. Through a ventilation system that Grace had mapped from the external hull scans and that she navigated now from memory, in zero gravity, in almost total darkness, with the calm of someone taking an evening walk. We reached the command section in 11 minutes. The ship's historian was not supposed to be there. He was, I say he because the translator assigned to our unit had established that this individual used a grammatical form that corresponded most closely to masculine, a Kethera academic who had been documenting the integration of what he had classified in his notes as a prestellar biological complex of moderate tool-using capability. The documentation project. Us. He had been on the bridge reviewing his compiled observations when we came through the access panel, and he did not run, which surprised me, and he did not reach for anything that resembled a weapon, which surprised me more. He stood very still and looked at us with large, amber-colored eyes that contained an expression I could not read but that felt, somehow, like recognition. Our translator, a small device clipped to my collar that had been fed 6 weeks of intercepted Kethera communication data, processed the sounds he made. "You are smaller than the models predicted," it rendered, in a flat synthetic voice. "We get that a lot," Owen said. He had lowered his weapon but not put it away. Grace had moved to the console to begin the data extraction we were here for. Finn was holding the access panel. I looked at the historian. He was looking at me with that unreadable expression. "Your name," the translator said, and I realized he was asking, not stating. "Vasquez," I said. The translator rendered this. He made a sound back. "He says his name is approximately," the translator paused for a fraction of a second in the way it did when it was selecting from several inadequate options, a sound that corresponds to a concept of recorded memory. "He is the ship's keeper of records." "I know what a historian is," I said. The translator rendered this. The historian made another sound. "He says you were not supposed to be able to reach this vessel." "No," I agreed. "We were not." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, what are you?" "Not what species. Not what military unit. What are you?" The phrasing, even through the translation layer, felt different. Like the question behind the question was the one that mattered. I looked at him for a moment. Grace was working steadily at the console. We had approximately 6 minutes before the defensive teams below us completed their sweeps and realized the threat was not where they were looking. "We are from this planet," I said. "The one you came to. We have been here for a very long time." 200,000 years, he said, and the translator rendered it with something that might have been surprise. "We have that figure in our survey data." "Then you know the number," I said. "What you may not know is what 200,000 years of that particular planet looks like from the inside." He was silent. I pulled up my personal device, a battered thing I had carried since basic training, scratched and repaired 3 times, and I opened an audio file. It was something I kept with me not for any tactical reason but because it had been on the device when I was given it, left by the previous owner, a soldier who had been transferred before the invasion and whose name I had never learned. A piece of music. Old. Human. I played approximately 30 seconds of it. The historian went very still. "What is that?" the translator rendered. "Music," I said. "Made by a man who was losing his ability to hear when he composed it. He completed it anyway. That was approximately 200 years ago. We still play it." I put the device away. "Our records of your species," he said slowly, "indicate a pattern of repeated large-scale conflict over the entire period of your recorded history." "Yes. You have damaged your own environment significantly on at least 3 separate occasions." "Yes. You have, at multiple points in your development, appeared to be approaching civilizational collapse." "Several times," I agreed. "And yet you continued." "And yet we continued." He looked at me with those amber eyes for a long moment. Grace finished the extraction and gave me a silent signal. We had 4 minutes. "We assessed your species," he said, "as a moderate tool-using biological complex approximately 40 years from independent spaceflight. Manageable. Processable. A standard integration case." "I know," I said. "The assessment was incorrect." "Comprehensively," I said. He was quiet again. "Then, very carefully, we have integrated 12 civilizations. None of them continued after the initial demonstration of our capabilities. They assessed the situation, identified the rational course of action, and accepted terms. That is because they made decisions based on what made sense," I said. "We make decisions based on what we have always done. And what we have always done is continue." 3 minutes. I gave Owen the signal. "Why?" the historian asked. The translator rendered the word simply, flatly, but the expression behind it was not simple or flat at all. It was the expression of someone asking a question that their entire intellectual framework had not prepared them for. If the probability of success is low, why continue? In every rational model, the calculation produces one result. "Because someone has to," I said. "And because the calculation is never final until it is." We secured the historian with the other crew members in the forward hold. I was careful about it. Not gentle, exactly. There was a war on and I was a soldier and I did not have the luxury of gentleness, but careful. There is a difference. The ship was ours in 41 minutes total. The first boarding action in human history against an alien vessel. The command logs we extracted would be transmitted to the Joint Intelligence Center within the hour. The data in those logs would shift the course of the following 30 days significantly. I sat in the hold with the historian and the other crew members while our team secured the bridge, and I watched him. He was watching me back. "The music," he said eventually. "Your species makes art. During conflict. During everything," I said. "We have always made art. During famines. During illness. During wars." I thought about it. "Especially during wars." He processed this. "The species we have integrated previously made art only during periods of stability and growth." "That sounds peaceful," I said. "It is," he agreed. "But perhaps it is also," the translator paused, cycling through options, limiting. I did not answer that. I thought it did not need an answer. Outside the viewport, through the reinforced composite of the hull, I could see the planet. Blue and white and deeply, quietly patient. It had been there before us and it would be there after us, and it had watched us, if a planet could be said to watch anything, grow from creatures that climbed trees into creatures that climbed into space, carrying all of our history and all of our errors and all of our music with us. The historian looked at the viewport. I could not read his expression. You named it after soil, he said. Yes, I said. He did not say anything else for a long time. Part 4, the thing they did not model. The Kethera requested a ceasefire on day 112 at 0900 hours, and the message arrived in 17 different languages simultaneously, which suggested they had been preparing it carefully and wanted to leave no room for a claim of miscommunication. I was in the Joint Intelligence Center when the signal came in. The room had the particular atmosphere of a place where people had been working without adequate sleep for a very long time, paper everywhere, half-consumed drinks on every surface, a low constant hum of equipment, and the specific quality of alertness that exists only in people who are running on something beyond ordinary tiredness. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Shaw was standing at the main display when the signal resolved. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Dr. Singh across the room. They said ceasefire, he said. Not surrender. I noticed, she said. There is a significant difference. I am aware. He looked at the message for another moment. Get me Ambassador Osei. I had not met Ambassador Grace Osei before that morning. I had read about her. She had been a trade negotiator before the invasion, which was, as several people pointed out with varying degrees of irony, excellent preparation for what came next. She arrived at the center 40 minutes after the signal, carrying a document case that she set on the table with the deliberate care of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and intends to handle it correctly. She was perhaps 55, with close-cropped hair and eyes that moved through the room, taking inventory of everything in about 4 seconds flat. She shook Shaw's hand, nodded to Dr. Singh, looked at me briefly with an expression that categorized and filed me in a single glance, and then sat down and opened her document case. How long have you had that? Shaw asked, looking at the documents. Since day 8, she said. I thought it was reasonable to be prepared. She looked at the display showing the Kethera ceasefire request. Their timing is interesting. Day 112. Do we have an assessment of what changed in the past 48 hours that prompted this? Shaw pulled up the recent engagement summaries. The past 48 hours had included the successful boarding and capture of the forward command vessel, our team's action, which had yielded significant intelligence data, the collapse of 3 Kethera ground positions in the southern region due to supply line disruption, and a coordinated cyber and communications action that had temporarily compromised their orbital communication relay. Not devastating in isolation. Cumulatively, the picture was of a campaign that was not going the way it had been projected. They did their own calculation, I said from the back of the room. Several people looked at me. They recalculated the timeline and it does not converge on the result they expected. So they are resetting the table. Shaw looked at me. Sergeant Vasquez has had direct interaction with Kethera personnel, he said to the room, by way of explanation. Her read is relevant. He turned back to me. Go on. They are not surrendering, I said, because in their experience, the dominant party does not surrender. They are requesting a ceasefire because they want to move to a negotiation phase, and in their model, negotiation means we discuss the terms of our acceptance of their authority. They are not expecting us to arrive at the table as equals. They are expecting to manage the conclusion of this process. The room was quiet. Ambassador Osei looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the ingredients of one. That is an accurate assessment, she said. Which is why the document in this case is going to be somewhat educational for them. She would not let anyone read it in advance except Shaw, who read the executive summary and sat down with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Dr. Singh was allowed to review the linguistic framing sections. I was not allowed to read it at all, which I found simultaneously frustrating and reassuring. It meant the contents were significant enough to manage carefully. The formal response to the Kethera ceasefire request was transmitted at 1400 hours. It accepted the ceasefire as a temporary operational pause and proposed a formal negotiation session. The location proposed was neutral ground, a recaptured facility in the mid-northern region that had been prepared for exactly this purpose, which told me that Ambassador Osei had been thinking about this moment considerably longer than day 8. The Kethera response to our counterproposal took 6 hours. When it came, it accepted the location and proposed a delegation of 4. We proposed a delegation of 7. They counter-proposed 5. We agreed to 5 on their side and 6 on ours, and that exchange, that particular back and forth over delegation numbers, was the first negotiation we had ever conducted with them, and I noted that they had moved from their initial position in response to pressure, which meant the model that said this species never moved from initial positions was already being revised. I attended the first session as part of the security advisory team, which meant I sat along the wall and was not supposed to speak and was supposed to observe everything. I had been told this clearly and I took it seriously. I observed. The Kethera delegation arrived precisely on time. 5 figures, all senior by the markings on their equipment, moving with the controlled precision that I had come to recognize as their version of formal presentation, everything compact, nothing wasted, deliberate emphasis on competence and authority. Their lead negotiator was larger than the others, with darker coloring and a particular stillness that read, across species lines, as confidence. Ambassador Osei was already seated when they arrived. She did not stand. She looked up from her notes, nodded once in greeting, and returned to her notes. The Kethera lead negotiator observed this and said something to the translator that came through as, "Shall we begin?" "When you are ready," Osei said, without looking up from her notes. The lead negotiator paused fractionally. "A small thing." I noted it. They sat. The session began. The Kethera opened with what Dr. Singh later described as a standard integration phase opener, a formal recitation of their position, their capabilities, their terms of settlement, and an invitation to discuss the practical arrangements for transition. It was, she said, word for word the same framing they had used with every prior species. A proven script. A model that had worked 12 times. When they finished, Osei set down her pen, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Thank you. We have reviewed your position. We have our own." She opened the document case and placed a document in front of the lead negotiator. The Kethera translator on their side processed it. The lead negotiator began to read. The silence that followed was very long. During that silence, one of the junior Kethera delegation members, a younger figure seated at the far end of their side of the table, leaned slightly toward the one next to them and made a very quiet sound. The translator on my collar caught it. It rendered as, "The document is long." The other one responded with something that rendered as, "It is very long." I kept my expression carefully neutral. The lead negotiator looked up from the document. "This section," they said, through the translator. "This section here. This refers to material compensation for," a pause while the translator worked, "losses incurred as a result of the commencement of hostilities." "Yes," said Osei. "You are requesting compensation." "We are." "From us." "You initiated the engagement," Osei said, in the same tone she might use to point out that it was raining outside. The principle that the initiating party bears responsibility for incurred costs is well established in our legal tradition. We are not bound by your legal tradition. You are now engaged in a negotiation with us, Osei said. Which means you are engaged with our frameworks, since this is our planet. That was your choice. We are happy to conduct this under your frameworks instead, if you prefer. She paused. Though I should note that under your frameworks, by your own established precedent, a party that has failed to achieve military objectives within the projected timeline is considered to have forfeited their primary negotiating position. The Kethera delegation had a brief internal exchange. The translator picked up fragments. "She knows our precedent." "How does she know our precedent?" "The boarding." "They took the historical records." A pause. "They read them." "Of course we read them." "What did they think we boarded the ship for?" During a recess that the Kethera requested after the first 3 hours, I stepped outside the building for cold air and found the Kethera intelligence officer who had been part of their security detail standing near the perimeter. Not doing anything. Just standing. Looking at the sky. I stood near him. Not beside him, a respectful distance. After a moment, he made a sound. The translator rendered it as, "Your people have been angry about this invasion for longer than the invasion itself has lasted." "Yes," I said. "In our experience, conflict produces a desire for resolution. The longer a conflict continues, the stronger the desire for resolution. Resolution comes with acceptance of terms. In our experience, I said, conflict produces a memory. And the memory lasts considerably longer than the conflict. He was quiet. Your species, he said, keeps records of old conflicts. Wars that ended many generations ago. Extensively, I said. We write books about them. We make films. We teach them in schools. Some of our most significant cultural and legal systems emerged directly from processing things that happened hundreds of years ago. He was very still. You carry the past with you. Like luggage, I said. Very heavy luggage that we absolutely refuse to put down. He looked at me. This makes you, he searched for the word, more difficult to manage. It makes us ourselves, I said. I do not know if difficult is the right framing. He turned back to look at the sky. I could not read his expression. But the quality of his stillness had shifted, less the stillness of confidence, more the stillness of genuine reflection. When you look at that sky, he said, what do you see? I looked up. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing what late afternoon light does in that region, softening everything, turning the edges of clouds golden, making the world look briefly like something out of a painting. Home, I said. He was quiet for a long time after that. The negotiations resumed. They continued for 9 days, and by the end of the third day, the Kethera delegation had stopped operating from their opening script. The script had not accounted for what they were encountering. By the 5th day, they were requesting overnight recesses to consult with their command structure, which meant the document Osei had produced was prompting conversations at levels above the negotiating team. By the 7th day, the lead negotiator looked like someone who had arrived expecting to manage a conclusion and had discovered that the conclusion was considerably more complicated than anticipated. On the 9th day, they asked for a 2-day extension to the ceasefire so that additional members of their command structure could review the document. Osei granted it. Shaw found me in the corridor afterward and said quietly, do you know what is in that document? I have a sense of the general shape of it, I said. It is the most thorough piece of paperwork I have ever seen in 22 years of military and governmental service, he said. She has cross-referenced every piece of Kethera precedent we retrieved from the ship and built an argument using their own legal frameworks. She has cited their own records. She has quoted their own historians. I thought of the historian on the ship, watching me play that piece of music, looking at the planet through the viewport. She used our anger, Shaw said. Every recorded instance of damage and loss and disruption from the invasion. She documented all of it. The full picture. And she presented it in a format that their own legal tradition recognizes as binding. And I said. He looked at me. They are reading their own rules and discovering that, by their own rules, they owe us something. He paused. Nobody has ever done that to them before. Nobody has ever read their own rulebook back to them. He walked back down the corridor. I stood where I was for a moment. Nobody had ever bothered, I thought. Nobody had ever been angry enough, and organized enough, and persistent enough to sit down and do the reading and build the case and present it with complete composure across a negotiating table. We had been. We were. We would continue to be. That was, I was beginning to understand, exactly the problem the Kethera had walked into and were only now realizing the shape of. Part 5, what we named it after. 18 months after the ceasefire, I was standing in my mother's backyard watching my nephew chase fireflies. His name was Oliver, and he was 7 years old, and he had the absolute confidence of a person who has not yet learned that catching fireflies is difficult. He ran through the grass in the early dark with his hands cupped, crashing through every obstacle with the determination of someone for whom the word impossible is just a word that adults use when they are tired. Every few seconds a small light blinked in the grass ahead of him and he adjusted course without pausing, without hesitating, without calculating the odds. I sat on the back step with a cup of tea and watched him. The sky above was clear. It was summer in this part of the world, and the air was warm and thick with the smell of cut grass and approaching night, and the first stars were beginning to come out, actual stars now, not the violet blooms that had lit the sky 18 months ago. Actual stars. The kind that had always been there, would always be there, patient and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they exist completely outside of human concern. I had been home for 6 weeks. My discharge had been processed efficiently, which surprised me. The military is not typically efficient about paperwork, and I suspected someone had made a deliberate decision to move the veterans through the system quickly. Get them home. Let them be somewhere that is not a command post or a field hospital or a negotiating room. Let them remember what the world feels like when it is not in crisis. It turns out remembering is its own kind of work. My mother had handled my homecoming with her characteristic combination of warmth and practicality. She had made a large meal, asked no questions she did not need answers to, and then given me my old room, which she had kept exactly as I left it in a way that I found both touching and faintly eerie. She had, at some point during the 18 months I was away, replaced the mattress, which I appreciated more than I said. I had not left the house much in the first 2 weeks. Not out of fear, or not only out of fear, which is the honest version. Mostly because the world outside was doing the thing it always does after a large collective experience, which is processing. Everyone was processing. The news was processing. The government was processing. Strangers in shops were processing. I could see it in the way they looked at each other, the slight delay between seeing and responding, the quality of attention that had not quite resolved back to normal. I understood the feeling. I was doing it myself. Owen sent a message in the 3rd week. He had gone back to Wales, to his mother's house, to the village he had described to me once during a very long night watch as the kind of place where nothing happens and where that was, for him, the highest possible recommendation. He said the coffee was better. He said he had started running in the mornings, which he had never done before, because his body did not know how to be still yet. He said the hills were good for it. I wrote back that I was glad he was well and that I was working on the still part. He replied, "Give it time. Also try the running. It helps." Grace Turner was teaching. She had gone into secondary education, which surprised everyone who knew her and somehow also surprised no one. Finn Alcott was studying engineering. He had sent one message that said, "Back in school." Turns out 0G boarding tactics are not a directly transferable skill, but the problem-solving approach is useful. That had made me laugh for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise. Dr. Singh was still working. Of course she was. She had moved from the Intelligence Center to the newly established Cathera Relations Division, which was the government's formal mechanism for managing what came after. The ceasefire had held. The negotiations had concluded, not perfectly, not to anyone's complete satisfaction, but then complete satisfaction was not the point of negotiations. The point was a framework. A set of terms that both parties had signed, however reluctantly on the Cathera side, and however carefully on ours. I had read the final agreement when it was released publicly. Osei had not gotten everything she asked for. But she had gotten substantially more than anyone had expected, and the parts of the document that used Cathera legal precedent against the Cathera themselves, those parts had held. Their own lawyers had tried to argue around them and failed, because you cannot argue around your own precedent when someone has documented it correctly and cited it to your face. Osei had been appointed to lead the ongoing diplomatic mission. The appointment had been announced with the sort of official gravity that suggested it was genuinely understood by the people making it. I had felt something uncomplicated when I read it. Straightforward satisfaction. The Cathera Relations Division had issued its first public summary of developments 2 weeks before I came home. Among other things, it noted that within the Cathera academic community, a significant philosophical debate had emerged regarding the species' historical model of civilizational development. The trigger for the debate was, as the summary carefully put it, the anomalous response of the third planet of this system to integration efforts. The anomaly. That was us. The thing that did not fit the model, so they were revising the model. I thought about that a lot. On a morning in the 4th week, I had turned on the news and watched a Cathera cultural representative speak to a human audience through a translator. The representative was part of the first formal exchange mission, 12 Cathera academics, historians, and cultural observers living and working among human institutions for a 6-month period, a parallel arrangement to a human delegation doing the same on one of the Cathera's settled worlds. The representative spoke about their initial impressions. She, the translator used she, said that she had not expected the density. Not of population or infrastructure. Of memory. Everywhere I go, she said, there are records. Monuments. Preserved places. Your species keeps everything. Not everything, the interviewer said. More than any species I have encountered, she said. The weight of what you remember is, she paused, and the translator paused with her, and when the rendering came it was, structural. It holds you up. I had thought about that for a long time. Oliver had stopped running. He was standing completely still in the middle of the grass, hands cupped, barely breathing. I watched. His hands lit up from the inside, a small, brief, golden light. He had caught one. He stood there for a moment, looking at his own hands. Then he walked over to me with the careful, serious walk of someone carrying something fragile and important. He held his cupped hands out. Through the small gap between his fingers, I could see the light pulsing. On. Off. On. Off. Don't open them, I said. If you open them, it will leave. I know, he said. I just wanted to show you. He looked at his hands for another moment. Then he walked back to the middle of the yard, knelt down, and opened his hands. The firefly lifted, blinked once, and was gone into the dark. He stood up and went back to running. I sat with my tea and watched him and did not try to explain to myself exactly what I was feeling because some feelings resist explanation and it is better to simply let them be. 3 days after that, I got a message that I had not expected. The subject line read, "From the Keeper of Records, forwarded through the Kethera Relations Division, with their thanks and apologies for the delay in transmission." I opened it. The historian had written, if writing is the right word for what they do, which the translator's note said was not precisely the right word but was the closest available equivalent, a long message. The translation was imperfect in places, flagged with brackets where the rendering was approximate, but the shape of it was clear enough. He said that he had returned to the homeworld. That he had resumed his work, which had previously been concerned with the documentation of integrated species. He said that his work had changed significantly. He was now engaged in what he described as a revisionary project of considerable scope, which involved going back through every prior integration and asking, for the first time, questions that had not previously been considered worth asking. What did those species remember? What had they made? What did they carry with them that the integration process had not accounted for? He said the project was generating substantial debate. He said that he had listened to the piece of music I had played for him many times since. He had obtained a full recording through the exchange mission. He had shared it with colleagues. He did not have a framework for it yet, for the experience of beauty produced during suffering, for art that exists because someone needed to make it, but he was working on one. He said that he thought of the planet often. The blue and white one, the patient one. The one named after soil. And then, at the end, he said, I asked one of your diplomats to explain the name. She said that the word, in its oldest form, meant simply the ground beneath you. The place you stand. Not a monument. Not an aspiration. Just the ground. Where you are. Where you return to. He said, I think I understand now why a species would name itself for that. You are not defined by where you are going. You are defined by what you return to. That is something none of our models had accounted for. That is what we missed. I read it twice. Then I set it down. Outside, Oliver was still running, still chasing the small blinking lights through the dark, completely committed to the effort in the pure way of someone who is not yet old enough to have learned that some things cannot be caught, only followed. I thought about Owen writing notes in a notebook on a frozen ridge. I thought about Dr. Singh's color-coded reports and the blank classification field in the Kethera document. I thought about Grace navigating a maintenance corridor in the dark from memory. I thought about Finn with the breach equipment, 40 seconds to get the door open, just a little too slow by our standards, just barely possible given the circumstances. I thought about Ambassador Osei placing a document on a table with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I thought about the historian asking what we were, in a hold full of the quiet, bewildered crew of a ship that had never imagined being boarded. I thought about the music. The men who wrote it losing the very sense he needed most to write it, writing it anyway. We still play it. We have played it for 200 years and we will play it for 200 more, and that fact is both obvious and astonishing, and it is also, I think, the truest answer I could have given to any question the historian asked me. I picked up my tea. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. The stars were fully out now, clear and unhurried above the yard. Somewhere among them, a fleet that had arrived with certainty and left with something more complicated was making its way home, carrying with it a revised model, a philosophical debate, a long document signed under their own precedent, and, I chose to believe this, because it seemed right, a recording of a piece of music written by a man who could not hear it. Oliver came and sat beside me on the step. He was tired now, the chase finished, the evening done. He leaned against my arm. "Did you catch any more?" I asked. "2," he said. "I let them all go." "Good," I said. He looked up at the sky. Children look at the sky differently after an invasion. They still look at it the way children should, with curiosity, with the open receiving attention of someone who has not yet decided what the world is, but there is something else now, too. A small additional awareness. Like knowing a word you did not know before, and now that you know it you notice it everywhere. "Are they still up there?" he asked. He meant the Kethera. "Some of them," I said. "Not the way they were. They are not trying to land anymore. Because we stopped them. Because we stopped